So we're going to do a combination of a couple of things this morning. This is the third virtual tour that I've done, and I know from looking at our registration list, we've got people who actually participated in both of the earlier virtual tours. We've got folks who have been to the center before, but perhaps have not had the tour with me. And we've got a bunch of people who have never been to the center, and perhaps even not even to Beaufort ever before. So this is your chance to see what we do here from wherever you're joining us from. This tour will be slightly different than the ones I've done before. I never like to give the same tour twice. That's no fun for me, and then it becomes no fun for you. So as you can see on your screen, we've got a slide up, and I'll be using a couple of slides today. I'll also be having the camera looking outward so you can see what I'm seeing as I'm talking to you about some of our exhibits. And every so often, I'll put the camera back on me so I can talk to you a little more directly as well. So that's our plan. The first time I advertised the virtual tour, I said we would do this for about a half hour. And an hour and 16 minutes into that half hour, I realized perhaps I had underestimated the length of time it takes for the director's tour. So today we're going to go about an hour, give or take. And we're going to add one additional feature to the end for those of you who can stick around beyond that hour. I have not been able to do Q&A as part of this virtual tour experience before, but we're going to try that at the end. So for those of you who can stick around a little bit later, say 11:15 or so when we end the tour, I'll switch your microphones on, and that'll be your chance to ask any questions that we haven't covered in the tour at that point. So that's our game plan, gang. We are looking right now at Mr. Conroy. I imagine that's a face familiar to you by virtue of you wanting to join us with our virtual tour here this morning. He's the author of 12 books, 11 published during his lifetime, and then A Low Country Heart came out after Pat passed away. 4 of those books were made into major motion pictures. Those 4 we see up in the top other than the boo. So The Water is Wide was made into the film Conrack, and then later re-released in a different format by Hallmark Hall of Fame as a film simply called The Water is Wide. Great Santini was made into a film that was shot right here in Beaufort, Lords of Discipline, also made into a film, of course, and The Prince of Tides, Pat's big hit, also shot in its film form primarily right here in Beaufort. And if I can, yep, look at that. Here's a look at those movie posters right there. So even if you're not familiar with every single one of Pat's books, there's a better than average chance you've seen at least some of those films. What they all have in common, the theme that Pat Conroy circled back around to time and time again, was the relationship between students and teachers. This is instrumental to his young life, and it's something that he wrote about time and time again in his memoir and fiction. Virtually every piece of writing Pat Conroy ever published had something to do with the relationship between student and teacher. And that's the Conroy that we honor here at our Pat Conroy Literary Center. We can't write as Pat did, but we can certainly do a little more with Pat's work as teacher. Let me see if I can flip this camera around. There we are. That's actually what I want you to see right now. There's a look at our Conroy Center as I can see it from where I'm standing. And for those of you who visited us before, you know the space is about 3,000 square feet, little sections of exhibits here and there. And today we're going to go through about 4 of those sections. But before I do any of that, I want to tell you a little bit about how I came to know this guy. There I am. Hi, everybody. Again, thank you all for joining. I am Jonathan Haupt. I'm the director here at the center. I got to know Pat Conroy for about 12 years. And during those last 5 years, Pat and I were great friends. Let's see, are you looking at me or are you looking at somebody else? Let me see. Gang, if you can see me right now, give me a wave. So I think we've got the camera in the right spot. Good, okay, that's a good sign. Sorry, I just had somebody else join. I want to make sure we get everybody in that we can. So I came to know Pat when I was at the University of South Carolina Press in Columbia, which is our state's major university or flagship university, and the press was publishing about 50 books a year. Pat had some relationship with that press, and he and I became friends when I was hired as publicist. But in time, I got the opportunity to apply to be the director, the publisher of that press, and Pat Conroy wrote a beautiful letter of recommendation for me, and I'm going to share that with you this morning. It does a couple of things for us. One, it lets me show you what Pat's handwriting looked like, which is pretty interesting in itself. It's going to tell you a little bit about me and my relationship with Pat. It's going to tell you quite a lot about what it was like to be a friend of Pat Conroy. So I'm going to load that slide up. I will warn you that I'm on an iPad, so when it looks like I'm trying to poke your eye out through the screen, that's just me trying to load a photo for you to see. Let's see where that one is. There we are. So here's the letter, and I'll blow this up so we can all have a look at this together. And again, this is Pat's handwriting, wonderfully, wonderfully precise handwriting. Dear Dr. Steve Lynn, first of all, I love that he spelled out doctor. That's sort of quintessential Pat Conroy right there. My name is Pat Conroy, and I'm a South Carolina writer. That is a completely unnecessary sentence because everyone in South Carolina knew at least that much about Pat Conroy. He was a really humble person, so he felt obligated to write that. But here's how the letter really picks up. I've got 4 brothers and a sister who are gamecocks and consider me a much lesser man because I'm only a Citadel bulldog. I'm writing this letter in support, no, to ridiculously enthusiastic support of Jonathan Haupt for the full-time director of the South Carolina University Press position. I do not have to tell you this, Dr. Lynn. I believe the South Carolina Press represents the cultural heartbeat of the state. I have a long and fruitful association with it, and Jonathan Haupt recently got me to write an introduction to State of the Heart, group of personal essays by South Carolina writers edited by Aida Rogers. The amazing thing about this fact is that Jonathan Haupt has never passed a single nickel or dime from his hand to mine. He gets me to do things by his professionalism, his complete charm, and the love of the work he does. He understands his role as a caretaker of the South Carolina experience, and he causes me to think about it as he entices me in his Cobra-like fashion when he explains what new favor I can do for him. If he gets this job, I would like you to demand he never ask a single thing of me again. But I admire his passion, his dedication. Sorry, I'm moving the letter up here. Here we are. I admire his passion and dedication for his job and his enormous dedication to getting it done right. I was once a student of the great James Dickey in your campus, and it was in that class that I learned the central importance of the South Carolina Press. I think Jonathan Haupt is the best thing that ever happened to the press. I encourage your committee to support him and get him off my back. Very sincerely yours, Pat Conroy. So that's what it was like to know Pat, to be both his friend and his student, and in some ways his mentor, to get to teach the teacher. This photograph behind me on this side of me over here was taken in Columbia after an event that Pat Conroy and I were doing together. This was taken after a TV interview. Ian Corey was the photographer for that, excuse me. And it turned out to be this wonderful image of Pat and I together, teacher and student, sort of arm in arm, walking up this ramp together. Path I think we're still on, even though he's no longer here to walk it with me. But being able to leave the University of South Carolina Press and come here and take charge of the Pat Conroy Literary Center has been a great honor of my life. Pat meant quite a bit to me when he was around, and he still does now as well. So I want to tell you stories, not so much about old man Pat Conroy, who was my friend and my mentor, but about the guy before that, the guy that I did not get to know in person, but have come to know through working here at the center and meeting those of you who have shared your stories with me, and also the stories that Pat shared in his own works. So I'm going to flip the camera around, and we're going to go right over here, and I'm going to see if I can do this as well. So now we're looking at a photograph of the Conroy family. Let me see if I can get it where we're not getting so much glare. We'll get a little closer to it in just a second. This photograph was taken in 1968 in Pensacola, and that is Pat in the back. He is the oldest of 7 siblings. Let's move up here. Still getting a little glare. Center really isn't designed to be doing virtual tours, so we're going to be working against the lighting every so often. That's Pat in the back. This is just before he went out to teach on Defusky Island. He is surrounded by his parents and his other 6 siblings. That's the colonel up front in his dress uniform, Colonel Don Conroy, one of the most highly decorated Marine aviators of his generation. Colonel served with distinction in World War II, in Korea as a member of the Black Sheep Squadron, and then 2 tours of duty in Vietnam. But like many men of his generation, he could not leave the battle on the battlefield. He was physically and verbally abusive to this whole family, and Pat, as the oldest, and Pat's mother, Peg, got the worst of that. and that is Pat's mother we see up front there, Southern Beauty. She grew up in very rural Georgia and Alabama without much access to public education, but by virtue of access to libraries and librarians, she was able to fill in the gaps in her education and was incredibly well read, and that's something that she instilled in Pat at a very young age. In the back there, we see Pat's two sisters. In the red is the older of the two sisters. That's Carol Ann. Like Pat, she went on to become a published writer, published poet. On the other side of Pat is Pat's sister, Kathy, and Kathy lives right here in Beaufort. She is a retired nurse and a board member and volunteer for us here at the Conroy Center. And then we see Pat's other brothers around him there as well. In the back, in the glasses, that's brother Jim. In the back, without the glasses, is brother Mike. And then up front, the two youngest brothers, we have Tim in glasses and Tom without. Tim is also a published author. After retiring from a really wonderful career in education as a special ed teacher and school administrator, Tim jumped into the writing life he had been putting off until that point. He thought having two writers in the family was plenty. But after Pat passed away, Tim fell back in love with writing poetry, and now he has a book of poetry out as well. So this is our crew, and I'll tell you a little bit more about Pat's parents as we go through our tour, but I wanted you to get a look at everybody right now. I'm going to spin around and we're going to go over to the section of our Conroy Center that is about Pat's experiences coming here to Beaufort. Now, we've met Pat's dad, a fighter pilot. Pat grew up as a military brat, and the family moved quite a bit because of that. When they came to Beaufort in 1961, it was the 23rd time the family had moved since Pat had been born, and Beaufort High School was the 10th school that Pat went to. He was entering the 11th grade. So he's always been the new kid. It's been a new school, a new town every single year. And because of that, Pat has never had enough time to make any friends, to get noticed by teachers, to have any kind of real relationships outside of his family. But when they arrive in Beaufort, things are very different here in a number of ways. And those ways make Pat Conroy possible. They arrive in '61, just before the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's why it's so important to have a guy like Don Conroy here at the Marine Corps Air Station in Beaufort. And they arrive knowing the colonel's appointment is going to be for 2 years. So Pat, for the first time in his life, is going to go to one school with one group of students and one group of teachers for 2 years, his junior and senior year. So he arrives knowing he's going to graduate from Beaufort High. And with all of those things going for him, Pat Conroy starts to emerge. In the course of those 2 years, he goes from being the shy, awkward kid he had been everywhere else to being senior class president, Mr. Congeniality, best all around, captain and MVP of the basketball team. He's playing other sports as well. He's in the National Honor Society. He's everything you can be at Beaufort High School. And it's because that school is so welcoming to military brats. It was true then, it was true today as well. Beaufort is a military town. Between the air station, the Parris Island Training Depot, and the Naval Hospital, collectively Tri-Command, there are a lot of military brats here in Beaufort. Pat was one of them in the 1960s. So this school gave him a chance to start to figure out who he was going to become. It's also where Pat Conroy's literary career began. That photo that we're looking at in the corner there of Pat and those two young women, that's a photo of the editors of Beaufort High's literary magazine called The Breakers. Even though Beaufort's a small town in the South that seemingly wouldn't have a lot of extracurricular activities, because of the military presence, it did that. People came from all over, and their kids expected to have the same quality of education that they had wherever they had come from. So Beaufort had a lot of wonderful things at the high school, including this literary magazine, The Breakers. And in his junior year at Beaufort High, Pat started to have poetry published in The Breakers. Gang, it is some of the worst poetry you've ever read in your life. It is angsty teenage boy poetry because he's 16 years old, and nobody starts out writing The Prince of Tides. But every so often you see little hints, little promises of the writer Pat Conroy is going to become, even in those early pieces. And it means so much to Pat to be published in Breakers, to be read by somebody outside of his family and his immediate circle of friends, that by his senior year, he joins the editorial staff of Breakers, that literary magazine. And at 17 years old, he's already decided he's going to be a writer who helps other writers, which is the whole arc of the rest of his life. It begins because of Beaufort High School. And this photo we're looking at Pat and the two girls, these are 3 of the 5 student editors for Breakers, Pat's senior year at Beaufort High School. And all 3 of these kids go on to have careers in literature, not just Pat. So at a young age, he's meeting other people who are on the same path that he is. Next to him there, in the middle of that photo, is Julie Zakowski. She goes on to become the librarian at Beaufort High School and then the librarian and library director for all of Beaufort County. And she lives here in Beaufort to this day. And then next to her, the blonde at the far end of that photograph, that's Stephanie Austin Edwards, a fellow military brat just like Pat. Stephanie leaves Beaufort after high school, goes on to have a career of about 20 to 22 years on Broadway and in Hollywood as a dancer and a costumer, working with some of the major stars of our day. But she comes back to Beaufort in the 1990s, about the same time that Pat comes back when he's writing beach music. And she falls back in love with writing, a love affair that began right there in Breakers magazine at Beaufort High School. Stephanie is now a published novelist as well and a really fine writing teacher. We get to work with her quite a bit here at the Conroy Center, and I'll tell you a Stephanie story in just a second here. But I want to tell you about not just the students at Beaufort High School, but also the teachers. And as I mentioned, we have one of those teachers on the call with us this morning. Grace Dennis is out there somewhere in TV land. She was Pat's homeroom teacher at Beaufort High and also his teaching mentor during Pat's first years as a teacher. But the guy we're looking at in this classroom scene at the far end of that bottom row of photographs, opposite side of the kids from Breakers, that's Gene Norris. And Gene was Pat's junior year English teacher. And Pat wrote quite a bit about Gene. At this point in Pat's life, he's actively looking for models of adulthood, masculinity, who are very different than his father. Pat has decided he does not want to grow up to be a man like Don Conroy. And Gene shows him a different example. Let me see if I can get a nice close-up of Gene. There we are. Hope you all can see that. So there's Gene, and this lovely quote about Gene from Pat's book, My Reading Life. The longest essay in that book is called The Teacher, and it's all about Gene. This is what Pat wrote. His eloquence was so understated that it was almost unnoticeable. He displayed complete assurance in the composure and ease he brought to the art of teaching. At the end of the first day, I was impressed with the man. By the end of the first week, I was in love with him. He taught his students a language that was fragrant with beauty, treacherous with loss, comfortable with madness and despair, and a catchword for love itself. And it's in Gene Norris's classroom that Pat Conroy first starts to think about what it might look like if he, Pat Conroy, goes on to become a teacher as well. Gene brought the world into that classroom. He was not just teaching English. He was teaching a really wonderful set of life skills. But he also realized that education didn't happen just in the classroom. And Gene was a great proponent of field trips. Sometimes those field trips would be for the whole class. Sometimes they would be for the benefit of just 1 or 2 students. And when Gene realized that Pat had an interest in being a writer and actually the capacity to become a writer, he wanted to do something particularly special for Pat, and it was a field trip to go see this guy. This is Archibald Rutledge. He was Pat Conroy before there was a Pat Conroy. In the 1960s, when Pat was a student at Beaufort High, Mr. Rutledge was the most famous, the most well-published, the most immediately recognizable literary figure in South Carolina life. He was our state's first poet laureate. He was the author, in addition to thousands of poems, of hundreds of short stories about hunting and fishing, things that were published primarily in what at the time were called boys' adventure magazines, so what we would now think of as young adult writing. But Mr. Rutledge lived at his family home, Hampton Plantation, which is now a state park between Myrtle Beach and Charleston. And Gene Norris, the teacher, took Pat Conroy, the student, out to meet Mr. Rutledge. Archibald Rutledge was 83 years old when he met 16-year-old Pat Conroy. And he could have just pat him on the head and said, "Good luck, kid." But for reasons we may never fully understand, Mr. Rutledge walked Pat around the grounds of Hampton Plantation, that beautiful ancestral home of his, and taught Pat to recognize the names and the stories behind flora and fauna. Mr. Rutledge told Pat the story of how Francis Marion, the swamp fox, had been on those grounds during the American Revolution. At the end of the day, Rutledge took Pat into Rutledge's writing room, where we see Rutledge seated in that chair. And Mr. Rutledge took out a pad of paper and showed young Pat Conroy an unfinished poem, something that Rutledge had been writing that day. And he asked Pat, who remembers 16 years old, what would you do to make this poem better? Literature can always be improved. And Pat Conroy, so amazed that the most famous writer in South Carolina was asking his opinion, was talking to him writer to writer, peer to peer, that in the end, he finally was able to stutter out something about making a stronger rhyme rather, at the end of the poem. And Mr. Rutledge said, thank you, I'll take that under consideration. I'd love to know if Rutledge actually did that. If somewhere out there, there's a poem written by Archibald Rutledge that was influenced in some way by 16-year-old Pat Conroy, because that would be a pretty remarkable discovery. But let's get back to Jean Norris, because remember, it's Jean who's taken Pat out to see Mr. Rutledge. And on the ride back home to Beaufort, Jean asked Pat, what did you learn today? It's a good question for a teacher to ask a student. And Pat, very much like the students of today, thinks that it's his job to then parrot back every single thing that he's heard that day. So he starts to tell his teacher, Jean Norris, the stories and the names behind the Cherokee Rose and the different animals he was introduced to at Hampton Plantation. He starts to tell Jean about the swamp fox and the history of that place that he had been all day. And Jean says, no, 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 that is not at all the lesson that you learned today. Archibald Rutledge, most famous writer in South Carolina, just showed you how to treat another writer. He just showed you how to treat a no-account, snot-nosed 16-year-old kid who has the same dreams and ambitions he once had. Mr. Rutledge just showed you what your future is going to look like. And in that car, to his teacher, Jean Norris, Pat Conroy remembered saying this, if I ever get to be a writer, I'll be nice to every kid I meet. Well, that is an easy thing to say when you are 16 and you can't possibly imagine it actually happening, but it did happen to Pat. He did become a writer, and he was nice to every single kid that he met, and every writer as well. And I'll share a couple of those stories as we move along, but all of that began because his teacher, Jean Norris, recognized something in Pat, his potential to be a writer, and he gave him the best gift he could have given him. He introduced him to the most famous writer in South Carolina. So I want to tell you about another guy. In our last tour, I spent a little bit of time talking about Randy Randall and his father, Morgan Randall, who was the school superintendent. But today I want to talk about this guy right here. This is Pat's high school principal, Bill Dufford. And let me see if I can load this slide up for you too, so we can get a better look at Dufford and what Pat had to say about him as well. Pat described Bill Dufford as the most handsome man in all of Beaufort. May have been slight exaggeration, but he is nonetheless a good-looking guy. So here's a quote from Pat about Bill Dufford, and this appears in an essay called The Summer I Met My First Great Man, which is in a book called A Low Country Heart, which came out after Pat passed away. So this is Pat talking about Bill. I was in the middle of a childhood being raised by a father I didn't admire. And in a desperate way, I needed the guidance of someone who could show me another way of becoming a man. It was sometime during that year when I decided I would become the kind of man that Bill Dufford was born to be. I wanted to be the type of man that a whole town could respect and honor and fall in love with, the way Beaufort did when Bill Dufford came to town to teach and shape and turn their children into the best citizens they could be. Dr. Dufford was from Newberry, South Carolina. So was Jean Norris, for that matter. A lot of Newberry connections in Pat's life. But through no particular fault of his own, Bill Dufford was raised in a white supremacist environment, and he was still carrying that around with him when he came to Beaufort. Pat Conroy, however, before Beaufort, had been going primarily, as I said, to private schools, to Catholic schools, many of which had been integrated. So Pat had grown up in this integrated experience. And Pat's mother, Peg Conroy, her family, the Peaks, survived the Great Depression in part because of the generosity of Black sharecroppers, of African-American sharecroppers who lived nearby. So Pat had been raised really without a racist bone in his body. And he started to talk to Bill Dufford about what this experience was like. And he started to change Bill Dufford's mind. And when Pat Conroy went to the Citadel for college, Bill Dufford left Beaufort High and went back to school himself to get his doctorate in education at the University of Florida, under the guidance of a group of remarkable teachers who had a global view of education. Dr. Dufford comes out of that experience and goes on to become one of the leading figures and largely an unsung hero of successful school integration in South Carolina for the next 40 years. And all of that begins because of conversations he had with Pat Conroy, his student in Beaufort High School. Dr. Dufford is also showing Pat what it's like to be a leader in your community. And Pat starts to get some sense of that while he's a student at Beaufort High as well. Well, these are both men, and I want to introduce you to a really wonderful woman that student Pat Conroy met at Beaufort High as well, his first creative writing teacher, and a figure who's become quite fascinating to me. Let me see if I can load those photos up for you as well. There she is. And we're going to want that one, and that one, and that one. So many photos for this section, gang. Give me 1 second. We're getting close. Let's go with those for now. This is Ann Head. At the time that Pat Conroy was a student at Beaufort High, she was Beaufort, the town of Beaufort's most famous writer. She was from the Christensen family here in Beaufort, a family that goes back to the Port Royal experiment, and a very well-established family. And at this point in the 1960s, when Pat is a student at Beaufort High, Ann Head is being published in all the major women's magazines of the day. Short stories and also serialized novels, something we don't have quite so much of anymore. 4 of those novels were also published in book form, and one of them, Mr. and Mrs. Bojo Jones, was made into a TV film starring Desi Arnaz Jr. That book, Mr. and Mrs. Bojo Jones, was taught in high school classrooms for the better part of the last 50 years. It's a story of teen pregnancy, and it's credited alongside of The Outsiders, S.E. Hinton's novel, as helping create the young adult novel genre that's so popular today. Ann Head was a major writer. And Gene Norris recruited her to be the first creative writing teacher Beaufort High ever had, because he had 6 students who showed remarkable aptitude as writers, and one of those students was Pat Conroy. So Pat and 5 others got the benefit of instruction with Ann Head. And as Pat wrote, let me read this quote from Pat. This appears in the essay, My First Novelist, from the Pat Conroy cookbook. On first sight, Mrs. Morris projected a steely withholding, an icy reserve that would have been off-putting to me, except for the thrilling fact she was the first novelist I'd ever met in the flesh. She looked like a woman who would not tolerate a preposition at the end of a sentence, or the anarchy of a dangling participle. She is not all warm and fuzzy like Gene Norris. She's not a trained teacher. She's never been a teacher. She's always been a writer. But what Pat Conroy discovers is that Ann Head, Mrs. Morris at this time, was able to open up on the page. As a writer, she could put everything about herself, but in person, she was always just a little bit withdrawn. So she and Pat become pen pals when he goes off to the Citadel. At the Citadel, Pat Conroy is still trying to write poetry, just as he had been at Beaufort High, and he's sending those poems back to Ann Head in letters for her to critique and respond. And she's always supportive, always wonderfully supportive, telling Pat he's on the right track. He's showing great promise as a writer. And frankly, that's not that easy, because his poetry at the Citadel has not gotten much better than it was at Beaufort High. And I want to share one of those poems with you. It's the most famous poem ever written in the history of the Citadel, according to Pat, written his freshman year, his knob year, as it's called at the Citadel. It's just 4 lines long, but it was published in the Shako, which is the literary magazine at the Citadel, and it made Pat immediately infamous on campus. Here it is, fall 1963 issue of the Shako, written at that time by D.P. Conroy, as he was calling himself. The dreams of youth are pleasant dreams of women, vintage, and the sea. Last night I dreamt I was a dog who found an upperclassman tree. Well, you can imagine how this went over at a military school to have a freshman write and publish this in a literary magazine for everyone to see. But the thing is, we don't actually have to imagine it, because Pat wrote about it in a letter to Ann Head. And here it is. This is unpublished, appears nowhere outside of these presentations. This is Pat writing to his teacher, Ann Head. The poems have been published, and one of them was nearly a preamble to my obituary. I was getting ready for noon formation when I looked toward my door. My roommate froze with fear. I was etched in doom, milling out there were about 1 million, yes, 100 million members of the upper classes. It was a lynch mob, hatred shown around about them, and I feared exceedingly. And this is one of those upperclassmen. Conroy, you not only found a tree, you also found a forest. I was scared that day, Mrs. Morris, but the net result was they liked me a little better. And the thing is, they did, in fact, like Pat a little better. So here's Pat at the Citadel. By his senior year there, he was once again captain and MVP of the basketball team, and once again a literary editor for the magazine, for the Shako, just as he had been in high school. So Pat, here too, is starting to get some sense of the man he's going to become. And it all begins with that famous 4-line poem published during his freshman year. Now, Pat went on to write 3 books about the Citadel. The Boo, his very first book, which we can see right there, self-published, and then the novel, The Lords of Discipline, and finally the memoir, My Losing Season. And in The Lords of Discipline, Pat recycles that 4-line poem. He gives that to the protagonist in that book to use again. So something Pat felt so strongly about, he circled back around to it one more time. When he graduated from the Citadel, he comes back to Beaufort High School, and he teaches there. This is before he goes out to Defusky Island. Let me see, there's Pat right there. Oh, look, Grace, there you are next to him. So this is Pat Conroy teaching at Beaufort High for 2 years. He graduates from the Citadel in '67, and the next 2 years he's teaching at Beaufort High, teaching government and psychology in that first year. But Pat discovers there's a problem at Beaufort High that no one is quite prepared to address, and he decides to take it upon himself to do that. And it had to do with teen pregnancy. It was a real problem at Beaufort High at this time, and there was no sex education class. So Pat Conroy, on his own, without really asking much permission, decided to incorporate human sexuality into his psychology class. And teen pregnancy rates at Beaufort High actually dropped. Something about hearing sex described by their teacher, Pat Conroy, made teenagers want nothing whatsoever to do with it. Very successful technique, as it turned out. I want to share a memory of what Pat was like as a teacher from one of his students, and it's from an essay that appears in this book, Our Prince of Scribes, Writers Remember Pat Conroy, of which I am the embarrassingly proud co-editor. This is a recollection from one of Pat's students named Valerie Sayers. And let me give you all something to look at. I got to park the camera for a second so I can grab the book. There we are. That's Pat teaching on Defusky. But this is how Valerie described her teacher, Pat Conroy. And I will point out that Valerie's father was the civilian psychologist at Parris Island. So her dad did for a living the thing that Pat was stumbling around this classroom, learning how to teach. Valerie should have been Pat's toughest critic. But this is the opening paragraph of her essay in Our Prince of Scribes, set in 1969. We must have called him Mr. Conroy, but that's hard to imagine. Outside class, if we thought we were cool, we referred to him as Pat. When we gossiped, we called him Pat Conroy, one word on one breath, a movie star's name. When he paced our high school psychology classroom, he was all performer, good looking in a Paul Newman, Cool Hand Luke kind of way, only taller, younger, cooler. He was master of the sudden pause, the beat, the punchline. He told us funny, self-deprecating stories, his fears, his gaffes, and we didn't believe a word. 2 years out of the Citadel, he was only 6 or 7 years older than we were, but he was Robert Kennedy, Wilt Chamberlain, and the Beatles rolled into one. Sounds like a remarkable teacher. Well, after 2 years of teaching at Beaufort High, population in town had changed, and that had a lot to do with integration. Private schools, what we would now perhaps think of as white flight schools, were popping up, and there was no longer a need for as many classroom teachers at Beaufort High, and Pat was on a year-to-year contract. So he'd begun thinking about going into the Peace Corps, and then he realized he could have a Peace Corps-like experience without even leaving Beaufort County. And that's what took him out to Defusky Island, where he was not only the first white school teacher, but also the first male school teacher. And he taught for 1 year there at the Mary Fields School. He was teaching grades 5 through 8, 18 students. Pat had no experience whatsoever teaching kids that young. These were African-American students, many of whom had never been off the island, and had not had access to the quality of education that their white counterparts in town had had. Many of them thought that Savannah was the largest city in the world because it's the only city they had ever heard of. They did not know the name of the Atlantic Ocean, even though that's the ocean that washes up on the beach at Defusky. Pat got out there and realized that separate had not been equal at all, and he threw himself into teaching these kids every single thing he could. One of those students, Sally Ann Robinson, who is the young woman we see raising her hand in that photo toward the top of your frame right now, has gone on to become a really successful writer as well. She's the author of 3 cookbooks, most recently this one, Sally Ann Robinson's Kitchen, and she also gives tours of Defusky Island. But I want to share with her, or with you rather, her memory of what her teacher, Pat Conroy, was like. This too is from an essay that appears in our Prince of Scribes. And give me 1 second to find Sally Ann in our list here. And I'll see if I can load this up for you. If we don't have it, we'll do this slightly different way. Now that slide is not in today's group. So let me see if I can find it very quickly in the book, and I'll just read it right out of there. It's right after Valerie's essay, so we don't have to go far. Here we are. This is Sally Ann Robinson remembering her teacher, Pat Conroy. That school year was unforgettable for me. Pat was patient and generous. He made every day an adventure while teaching us history, math, spelling, reading, music. You name it, he taught it. And all the while, he was preparing us for the wide world we were going to face once we left our island. He could take the words in a book and bring them to life for us, and we were amazed. That was Pat on Defusky. He inspired 4 of those 18 students to go on to become teachers themselves, and Sally Ann Robinson was one of them. That's what it was like to be Pat Conroy's student. However, in the 1960s and early 1970s, when all this was going on, Pat was deemed far too liberal for the time, and his reward for being such a fantastic teacher on Defusky Island was that he was fired for it. The school superintendent and the school board were not supportive of Pat at that time. They gave him a chance to resign rather than be fired, and told him that if he took that chance, he would be able to get a job as a teacher somewhere else, maybe not in Beaufort, maybe not even in South Carolina, but somewhere. But if he had a record of being fired for conduct unbecoming a professional educator, which is what they fired him for, and if he sued for wrongful termination and lost that case, he would never be able to get a job as a teacher again. Pat Conroy, remember, is the son of a fighter pilot, son of a warrior. So naturally, he took them to court. And right up until the moment the judge delivered the verdict, Pat and his lawyer, George Trask, were absolutely convinced they were going to win that case. And they were going to go, and Pat was going to go right back in the classroom. But they lost, and the school board's prediction was true. Pat was not able to get a job as a teacher again, but it lit the spark in him to write this, The Water is Wide, which I bet many of you are familiar with, and every other book that followed. It gave Pat the chance to rethink his life and to dive wholeheartedly into the writing life he had been putting off for his teaching life. And from that moment forward, Pat Conroy was a professional writer, but a writer who was always writing about teachers, always writing about students and teacher relationships. It was so central to his young life that continued to be central to his later years. And I want to share quickly a couple of stories and some photos about not Pat Conroy, a student, but with some students that we get to work with right here at the Conroy Center. Let me load these up for you. Here's one of them. So this is Stephanie Austin Edwards on the left-hand side there. That's the student I mentioned who was part of Breaker's Literary Magazine when Pat Conroy was a student. That's where Stephanie and Pat met. And I told you all that Stephanie now works with us here at the Conroy Center. And one day Stephanie comes into my office and says, wouldn't it be great if we had a high school student as an intern? And I said, that sounds like a terrible idea, Stephanie. Let's make sure we never ever do that. And then she goes on to convince me that there's this really wonderful student at Beaufort High right now who is a great writer, and she's president of her class, and she's a standout athlete. She's everything that Pat Conroy was when he was a student. And her name's Holland Perryman. So I got to meet Holland, and very much like Stephanie, I was impressed with her. And so now I was reminded of this particular phrase when I met Holland. If I ever get to be a writer, I'll be nice to every kid I meet. If Pat Conroy made that oath, then surely we can honor that here at the center. So now Holland does, in fact, work with us. And she's done quite a lot, both behind the scenes and in person. The photo we're looking at right now is Holland doing her first ever TV interview for us right here in the Conroy Center. She's also been a part of offsite programs that we've done, writers' conferences and events out on St. Helena Island, our annual March 4th event at Penn Center. Holland was a big piece of that this year as well. But Holland's story now takes us all the way back around to Ann Head as well. Remember, Ann was Pat's first creative writing teacher, and Ann's daughter, Nancy Thody, who's become a good friend of mine, wanted to do something right now to honor Ann. So she created the inaugural Ann Head Literary Prize for short story fiction at Beaufort High. And 40 students entered that contest this year. A winner and 2 finalists were named, and one of those finalists was their very own intern, Holland Perryman. So now there's this line that's been formed, this circle, if you will, that takes us all the way back to Ann Head at Beaufort High School. The winner of that contest was a really wonderful young writer named Claire Bowden, and there was another finalist, Emmett O'Brien, as well. So of those 40 students, 3 of them were deemed performing writing work well enough to be recognized by Nancy and her family, who were the judges. So we're real proud of all of those kids. I want to introduce you to one other kid that we work with here as well, or have worked with. Let me see if I can bring that photo up for you. And then I will show you an artifact here in the center that goes along with it. There he is. This is Anthony Johnson. He is now 17. He was 16 years old when he did this portrait of Pat Conroy. This is an art form that's called journal art. And what we mean by that is that Anthony didn't actually draw anything. He wrote it. Anthony came to Beaufort from Ohio, as so many people do, and he found himself a really wonderful mentor, very much like young Pat Conroy had. Her name is Mary Thibault, and she runs Thibault Art Gallery, which is on Bay Street, about a block away from where we are at the Conroy Center. And she became Anthony's mentor. She was also the person who introduced him to the writing of Pat Conroy, a writer that Anthony had never heard of before coming to Beaufort. So Anthony read the book, The Water is Wide, and he was so moved by it that he did this portrait of Pat. And what you see on there, the lines that are actually forming Pat's portrait, are quotations from the book, The Water is Wide, and then Anthony's stream of consciousness responses to that. Let me see if I can zoom this in for you a little bit so you can get some sense of how detailed this is. And then I'm going to switch the camera back on and show you the actual piece now that I'm standing in front of it. There we are. This was purchased for us by several of our donors. They were really supportive when they found out this existed and that I wanted to acquire it. But if I get close to it here, you can start to see the shape of letters, and this is what the whole thing is. It's really writing more so than it is drawing. Just an incredible piece. And South Carolina Educational TV, our local public television station, came out and did a short little 5-minute documentary about me and Anthony in this piece. And on the basis of that, he started getting a lot of commissioned work, which is primarily what he gets to do now. But it all began with this piece right here. So we're going to take a little walk now, gang, over to what our volunteers refer to as Santini Corner as we get near the end of our time together. So I can tell you a little bit about the redemption of Don Conroy, which is a fascinating story, and Conroy life as well. I will point out, as I said earlier, the center really isn't set up for virtual tours. We've got a lot of reflective surfaces, and right now you can probably see a shadowy figure reflected in that jacket. That is not the ghost of Don Conroy. That's just me, everybody. It'd be a more interesting story if it were Don, but that's just me. So I mentioned Pat's father at the start of our tour here. When Pat's novel, The Great Santini, came out in 1976, Don Conroy read it and he disappeared for a few days. He was so angry, so livid that Pat Conroy had been so truthful, even in this novel, this work of fiction, about what life was like in the Conroy household, that Pat had told the truth about the abuses that were going on. He had told the truth about his father. But several days later, Don reappeared and he had a letter typed up, presumably by his secretary, because Don didn't know how to type any more than Pat did. And it's a letter that was reprinted in full in The Death of Santini, so some of you may be familiar with it. We have a copy of it on display here at the center. I want to read just a couple of passages from it because this tells us quite a lot about Don Conroy in this moment and the transformation of him that was made possible because his son told the truth about the family. So this is a letter that Don wrote on May 15th, 1976. I'm going to read from the beginning, middle, and end of it. And if you want to read the whole thing, you can find it in The Death of Santini, pages 74 and 75, I think. It's addressed to the Magnificent Seven, meaning Pat and his 6 siblings. And again, this is the Colonel, Don Conroy. Let me start my epistle by simply stating that I was deeply touched by your oldest brother's latest literary endeavor. Pat is a very clever storyteller, and I was totally absorbed and encountered every emotion as, reading very slowly, Life with Father unfolded in this work of fiction. It was as though I knew some of the characters personally. In all honesty, I read the first 100 pages and I was furious. At page 222, not that the page is important, I was livid and put the book down. When I resumed reading it, it came easier for me, and I look back, the writer had me, as many readers will feel much the same, in the palm of his hand. I laughed at some scenes, I cried at others, figuratively speaking, of course, and you came away a better person for having lived with the Meachams. To Pat, my oldest son, may you forever wear the cloak of authority, as befitting the eldest Conroy, as a sign to all of our pride in you as son and brother. And may Barbara and your children have the patience to endure the idiosyncrasies of such a clan. Nowhere in that letter does Don Conroy ever admit that he beat his family, nor does he ever apologize for it. But from that moment forward, he committed himself to being the best father and uncle and grandfather and friend he could, in part to prove Pat wrong, to prove that he was not Bull Meacham, that he was not the fictional character the great Santini described in that novel. But the result was that Don Conroy had this remarkable second act, and he and Pat Conroy became great friends late in Don's life, and Pat actually took care of his father when Don was dying. But one of the things they would do would go out and do book signings together and compete to see who would have the longest signing line for the great Santini. And we have here in the center, although it's not typically on display, a really wonderful signed copy. This is a movie trade paperback, so we're looking at photos of the cast, obviously, on the cover there. And Don has signed this one, and let me show you this, and then I'll read it to you. So there is the Colonel's signature right there, and let me get it somewhere where I can read it to you. This is signed in 1981. Hope you enjoy this work of fiction about lovable, likable, who has never said a mean thing to man or beast. Love, Don Conroy, Colonel USMC, retired, the great Santini. So whenever Don would sign this, he would always point out that it was a work of fiction, and very often he would underline that word just to make it clear to the reader as well. But Pat told the truth about his dad, and his dad changed. Pat told the truth about education in The Water is Wide, and education changed. He told the truth about the Citadel in The Lords of Discipline, and the Citadel changed. That's a pretty remarkable track record, guys, for what a writer can achieve as a truth teller. We're going to make a little turn right here. There's Pat. Hey, Pat. And we're going over to our recreation of Pat's writing room, his office as it looked on Fripp Island. This is the desk that Pat used late in life. He came back to South Carolina in the 1990s after being gone for a while. And this is the desk he used when he was writing beach music and every book that came after it. I want to show you what Pat saw when he was writing. He never learned to type. His father, the Colonel, always thought Pat would grow up to be a fighter pilot like dear old dad, so he refused to allow his son to take typing. And so Pat wrote everything longhand. Here's the desk as it actually looked in the Fripp Island house. And we can see it's up against a window there. Pat was always looking out at the water when he was writing here in Beaufort, both at the Fripp Island house and at the house that he and Cassandra lived in when Pat passed away, where Cassandra lives to this day on Battery Creek. We don't have water here in our enclosed room, but we do have the benefit of this wonderful mural painted by the artist Aki Kato that makes the back wall of this exhibit. And if we walk around here and actually see Pat's setup, you can see we've got a yellow legal pad, which was always Pat's preferred writing method. There's a copy of our Prince of Scribes as well. I want to read you a short passage from that in just a second. We can see some of the books that Pat had. He had about 8,000 books in his personal library, which is a lot, I realize. And they were never just for show. Pat was committed to reading about 200 pages a day and writing about 3 to 5 pages a day. He was always first and foremost a reader and a writer second. That was something that he learned as a young man from one of his teachers, Joe Monty at Gonzaga High School the year before they came to Beaufort. And Pat's mother, Peg, felt very much the same way. And we can see photo of Peg right there above that TV screen. And I'm going to turn this way so I can show you a portrait of Pat on this wall. There we are. And I'm going to park the camera just so I can read a little passage for you written by the artist. We're looking at two pieces right there. On the left is a piece by Pat's daughter, Melissa, second oldest of the 4 Conroy daughters. Melissa is a really talented children's book author and artist as well. And this is a poster she did for her children's book, Poppy's Pants. And that character, Poppy, that we can see there is based on Pat. Melissa is a doll maker, so she made that doll as well. And the photo, or the portrait rather, that we're looking at on the right side there, that is a piece called Citadel Blue, and it is by the artist Nicole Seitz, who is co-editor of this book, Our Prince of Scribes. And I want to read to you just a brief passage from the end of Nicole's essay in Our Prince of Scribes. This is an essay called A Name to Remember. And this is something that she wrote just after Pat passed away, which is about the time that she was working on that portrait. I know this, even in death, Pat is still graciously giving, and I will spend the rest of my writer days trying to honor this man. It is with sincere regret that I didn't realize sooner that he was just a man and nothing as large as the pedestal I put him on. If I had figured this out sooner, I might have allowed myself into his orbit, but some people shine so brightly in this earthly life that it can be blinding. Pat Conroy was no god. He was simply a man. Flawed, authentic, brilliantly talented man bestowed with gifts of the pen and heart, both of which he used well. And in the end, it doesn't matter if he knew my name, because I know his, and it's one I hope to help carry on. And that's very much the spirit of our Conroy Center here. That's why this place was created, so that folks like you who perhaps did not know Pat, as those of us who did got to, would have something where you could come and visit and get to know him a little bit. It's also a place where we get to continue Pat's legacy as teacher as well and be inspirational to a group of young students and artists that we get to work with, like Holland and Anthony. I want to tell you about another group of students, and this is our second to last story, and it's the group of students who made this, our donation box. It's entirely free to visit the center, both in person and virtually. You all were able to sign up without any charge today as well. But I want to tell you about the group of students who made this, our donation box, for us. This is the opportunity for folks who visit the center to leave a little something behind in support of our nonprofit. And if I can get this photo to load, I can show you these kids. They're a really interesting group. They are from May River High School, which is in Bluffton, South Carolina, one town over from where we are. There they are. Give it a second to load. There we go. So these are the master fabricators. They are, as I say, a group of high school students at Beaufort, or at May River High School. And we asked them to make our donation box. We gave them no instruction whatsoever, just that simple request. So they came up with this design entirely on their own. As you can see, the base is the outline of the state of South Carolina. There are two palmetto trees, our state tree, growing up out of that base, and then a book on top of the palmetto tree. And to the kids, the book represented reading, writing, and education. So everything they thought was most important of Pat Conroy's legacy. They built this entirely on their own. When they delivered it to the center, they came dressed as you see them in that photo there with their teacher, Bradley Childress. And incidentally, if you ever saw Mr. Conroy in, say, the last 10 years of his life, you know that they accidentally came dressed as Pat Conroy. That was exactly his uniform, black t-shirt, khaki pants. That's their school uniform. It's entirely coincidental. They look like young Pat Conroys. But they showed up and there was this metallic jingle to that donation box. And I asked Brad, their teacher, what that was, if perhaps it had become damaged on the way over. He said, it's not that at all. Our class meets after lunch, and after we got the box finished, the kids started putting their change in it. So they delivered it with a donation already in it, and we've left those coins in the donation box to this day. Really remarkable gift to the center from this class, and sort of a good luck charm to us here at the center as well. So let me turn this back on. So we're almost back to where we started, gang, and we're back to 1968. And Pat Conroy and this photo. And I want to share with you a piece of fan mail that we received here at the center. And it has to do with 1968. We get quite a lot of letters. And after this virtual tour, you're all going to get an email from me, and it'll be your chance to leave some remarks and reviews about this virtual tour, either for us to use through the center or for us to post on TripAdvisor as well. But perhaps the most interesting piece of fan mail we got came from a really unlikely source, because we got a letter from Pat Conroy after he had passed away. And it's a little unnerving to get a letter from a deceased person. But in closing, I want to tell you that particular story. In 1968, when this photo was taken, that was after Pat's first year of teaching at Beaufort High, and he wrote a letter to Bill Duffert, that high school principal that we met earlier on our tour. And in that letter, Pat thanked Dr. Duffert for inspiring him, Pat Conroy, to become a teacher. Dr. Duffert had also been sort of Pat's surrogate father. Remember, Dr. Duffert was the guy who showed Pat what adulthood might look like if you become somebody other than Don Conroy. And the letter is very much about that as well, very much about that moment in 1968. But that letter was found in 2016. Pat wrote it in 68 and Bill read it, and it went into a box and nobody ever saw it again until it was discovered by Bill Duffert's archivist, Dr. Tracy Power, in Bill's papers at Newberry College in 2016. And at that moment, when that letter was discovered, was when we were on the cusp of announcing that the Conroy Center would be open to the public for the first time, and that what had begun as our Pat Conroy at 70 Festival, Pat's 70th birthday, was going to continue as our annual Pat Conroy Literary Festival, and also that I would be leaving the University of South Carolina Press to become the first director of our Conroy Center. And somehow Pat Conroy managed to write about all of that in 1968 as well. The letter read very much like it was from beyond the grave. And I want to share that letter with you. I'm going to put it on screen and then I'll read it from you. It's actually a very long letter, but this is from the end of it. And again, this is written in 1968. Pat Conroy was 23 years old. He's writing this to Bill Duffert, his high school principal and mentor. I have never understood the dynamics of hero worship. Maybe it was the discovery of the father I never had as a youth and finally found in you. Father who is not only stern, but tender, father of both the storm and the sun. It is important for you to know this effect you've had, and I believe you know it. But in the shortness and horrible brevity of life, I want to get everything said, everything. Someday I will exert the same influence over someone, and I want him to tell me, this is immortality. For what I have learned from you, I will pass on, and it will be passed on, and it will be passed on, and passed on. And that last line is effectively the mission statement of our nonprofit, Pat Conroy Literary Center. That's what y'all and I have been doing on this virtual tour for the last hour. I've taken the lessons that Pat learned from his teachers and shared with his students and his readers, and I've shared them with you in the hopes that you will now take charge of them and see that they're passed on and passed on and passed on. What I'm going to do now, gang, is two things. First and foremost, I'm going to thank you for joining us here at the Conroy Center for this last hour. I hope it's been enjoyable and meaningful for you. It certainly has been for me. It's been a pleasure to get to do this. It's a little more fun to do it in person, but I'm glad we have this opportunity to do it on screen. I've just given you all the capacity to turn your microphones on. I'm going to flip the camera around. There I am again. So again, thank you all so much for joining us on our virtual tour here at the Conroy Center. If you've never actually been in person, I certainly hope you get the chance. It's a really remarkable thing to do. I've shown you about a fourth of what's actually here. There's quite a lot of pieces we did not go through. And most of our docents, the people who give the tours, are folks like me who actually had the chance to know Pat in person. So in addition to showing you the artifacts, the stuff, we're also able to share with you our stories. So please do come join us at some point if you can. You will get a follow-up email from me that will have some links to videos with more information about some of the pieces I've shared with you. And that'll also be your chance to leave a review if you'd like to do that, or to make a donation if you'd like to do that, as many of you have already done. The microphones are now on, so if anybody out there has a pressing question that I've not asked for you, you can unmute yourself and ask that. If you need to go, by all means, you can exit the meeting. I can't actually see all of you, so it's not going to hurt my feelings if you leave. But if you do have a question, I want to make sure that we honor that as well. So I'll stick around for a while. Very happy to answer any questions you have. And again, thank you all so much. Appreciate your time this morning.
Jonathan, this is Ellie Levin.
Ellie.
Wonderful. Hey, it was a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. My question for you today is,
yes,
has this been recorded so that we may share this with some of our children?
That's a good question, Ellie. I'm going to warn you and everybody else, first of all, that I never give a short answer to a question. I can only give long answers. I am, protege of Pat Conroy. It's his fault. So I have been recording all of the virtual tours with the hopes of doing things with them. And you may have noticed, if you can see it, the record light has been on the whole time we've been in the session right now. I recorded the second virtual tour that we did, the one I did last month, for a very special audience of mine. I get to teach at the Allendale Correctional Institute to a wonderful group of writers out there, and I recorded the last virtual tour specifically for those guys who are never going to get to visit the center in person. So this was their chance to do that. We also posted that second virtual tour through our Facebook page, and if you get our email newsletter and open it, you may have seen that because we made that as part of our Giving Tuesday Now fundraising campaign. It was up for about 4 days and 450 people watched that version of the virtual tour. So I'm going to do the same thing with this one. It seems to have gone well, I hope. So I'm going to put this one out there for about a week. And when you get the email from me, it'll have a link to that YouTube video in there. It'll take a little bit of time to process, so it may not post until sometime tomorrow. You're absolutely welcome to share that with kids, your family, your friends, whoever. I want as many people to experience the center as possible, even if you can't be here in person. So the short answer to your question is yes. The long answer is everything else I just said. Thank you for asking that. Donna, I think you're trying to ask me something, but your microphone is still muted. So if you can switch that off, I can hear you.
How's
there
that?
You go. Yes.
Hi, Ellie. Is the center open now with COVID and everything? I didn't know if it was open.
We are not. Those of you in South Carolina who follow the ordinances our governor has put in place and then lifted may have noticed that tourist attractions, which include museums, are able to open this weekend, Memorial Day weekend. We, the Conroy Center, are choosing not to do that. I'm going to spend next week preparing us for that. We'll be open next Friday, Saturday, probably part of Sunday, sort of an unannounced opening just to sort of see how it goes. But that first weekend in June, we will be back up to our regular hours, those being Thursday through Sunday, noon to 4 p.m. So we're getting close to that point. I have, if you've been in the center before, you may have noticed as I walked around, things aren't where they normally are because I've moved them around to make the virtual tour a little easier. I have one more of those next week I'm doing for a private group. And incidentally, that's something you can now request too if your book club or your friends of the library or whomever wants to do a virtual tour of the Conroy Center, you can reach out to us and we can schedule those. But I do have one more next week that I need to get through before I can really open the center back up to the public again. But by the first weekend in June, you'll be able to do that. Thank you for asking that.
Jonathan?
Yes.
I've always had a question about the picture of Pat Conroy on the cover of our Prince of Scribes. You know, where he's barefoot standing in the pond and...
Yes.
Where is he and who thought of that idea and what's the relevance to him standing on water?
Thank you for asking that. I'm always happy to talk more about our Prince of Scribes, of course. That is a photo some of you may have recognized. It appeared on the very first issue of Garden and Gun magazine. And that's what it was taken for. Pat is actually standing in Mrs. Whaley's Charleston garden. Some of you may be familiar with Emily Whaley. Really wonderful character, let's say, from Charleston. And her garden on Church Street is the most famous, I want to get this right, the most famous private garden in Charleston. It's, oh, I wish I could remember the address, something like 81 Church Street. Pat's friend, Ann Rivers Siddons, the novelist, lived in the house next door. So when the Garden and Gun photo shoot was scheduled, it was originally scheduled to be in Ann Rivers Siddons' garden, which is also very beautiful. But the photographer who had never been in Charleston before arrives with Pat and Annie, and they're in her backyard. And he looks over the hedgerow and says, hey, that garden over there looks even better. Do you think we could go shoot over there? And Mrs. Whaley was long deceased by this point, but her daughter Marty, who's I think the second oldest of the three daughters, was living in the house that time and gave permission to go over and take that photo. And Pat is standing barefooted in the fountain in Mrs. Whaley's garden, something he was really reluctant to do. He did not think that was a good idea, but it turned out to be this beautiful, beautiful photo. And it sort of looks like he's walking on water, which is probably his resistance. Pat was always about demythologizing himself and not adding to the lore. But University of Georgia Press published Our Prince of Scribes, and they were able to do that with support from the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame. So they actually had, our publisher actually had a budget to go out and get a photo. But when we reached out to Garden & Gun and said, that's the photo that we want, they said, y'all just have it for free. And they did, because Garden & Gun and Pat had such a really wonderful relationship. They've been very supportive of the book too. So they gave us free permission to use that photo. If you've ever seen the issue of Garden & Gun, that first issue, you know, that's one of several images that were taken of Pat that day. There's another one in which he's holding a book. And he also wrote an essay that appears in that issue. I think it's called The Lady and the Tiger. And it sort of explains why this tiger, Caesar, the man-eating tiger, is in the novel, The Prince of Tides, and where the real inspiration for that, Happy the Tiger in Columbia, South Carolina, came from. When Pat is recalling the story of the real Happy the Tiger for Garden & Gun, he gets every single thing wrong, including the gender of the tiger. It's still a really wonderful essay, though, even with all the errors that Pat accidentally added to it. So again, a long-winded answer to your question, but those are the only kind I know.
Love it.
Thanks for asking that. Anybody else with a question out there? If we managed to cover all of them. Excellent. All right. And Grace has been awake the whole time, that is a good sign, Grace. You know, I think I've kept Bonnie awake too, so that's a good sign, I think.
Jonathan,
Well,
this is Ellie again. May I ask a question of Grace?
If Grace will turn her microphone on, if Grace will unmute, I bet you can do that. I'm looking at Grace right now. There we go. You're on, Grace.
You didn't. Hey, Ellie.
Hey, Grace, I just miss you so. I'd love for you to share a memory of teaching Pat, if you would.
I think my most famous memory is the day you walked into my homeroom, that 15-year-old little Irish lad, and it was kind of an instant thing. I'll always love Pat, and I didn't have the opportunity of actually teaching him, but thank you, Jonathan, for saying I was a mentor, because I think I was when we shared prep periods in that first year of his teaching, and we kind of taught each other. He was a wonderful friend, and as we all know, a magnificent writer. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that, Grace. Yeah, I think every one of us who identifies as a student or a teacher of Pat was always both. The lines were always blurred between those things. Mm-hmm. And those are the best kind of student and teacher relationships, where you really learn from one another. That has been my experience with young Holland Perryman, too, the intern I said I didn't want, and has now become so dear to all of us at the Conroy Center. And I think Pat would appreciate the irony of that. So thank you for asking that, Ellie, and thank you for answering, Grace. And that would be a nice one to end on, unless anybody has a pressing question we've not answered yet. All right, gang. Thank you all so much for joining us again. Look for that email from me within the next 24 hours or so. And please do visit us here in person if you ever get the chance. And y'all take care out there. Be safe.
Thank you.